This is Clay Rooks at City College. I'd like to talk to you today about cause and effect. When we're talking about causes, we're talking about the reasons why something happened, or the circumstances that made something happen or brought it about. In other words, when we're talking about causes, we're answering the question, why? On the other hand, when we're talking about effects, we're talking about the results of what happened, or a speculation about the outcome of something that might be if we take a particular cause or action. In other words, we're answering the question, what happened, or what if? When we do cause and effect analysis, especially in college papers, take history class, we might get a question like, what were the causes of World War I? Or, maybe in an economics class, we'll be asked, what circumstances brought about the recent economic collapse? In both of these cases, it's obvious that they're asking us, what were the causes? Why did this happen? On the other hand, if we're taking a sociology or a health class, perhaps we'll get a question like, what have been the effects of the AIDS epidemic on the American health system? Or maybe in a political science class, we'll get, what will be the results of implementing a new law to redraw the congressional districts in the state? In both of these cases, obviously, we're being asked about the effects, what will happen. When we do cause and effect analysis, sometimes it's a good idea to draw up a list of causes and effects. Let's take, for example, the topic air pollution. We want to look at causes, we want to look at effects. Some of the causes of air pollution would include things like smoke from fires, exhaust fumes from cars and trucks and planes, smog, certainly. Also things like dust and pollen, even geography. Geography, that sounds odd. Well, let's look, for example, at California. The Central Valley of California is completely surrounded by mountains. That holds in bad air. When you're looking at causes and effects, you need to look at everything. Also, we'd want to look at the effects. What are the effects of air pollution? Things like asthma and respiratory diseases like emphysema and allergies. These are effects of air pollution that tend to spread in the population. Also, things like acid rain and corrosion and erosion. These things have great monetary costs in the millions of dollars and are things that we would have to consider if we were analyzing air pollution. Now, there are two types of causes and effects. The first are immediate causes. Those are the causes that are closest to the event and the ones that are easiest to see. But there are also what's known as ultimate causes. Those are the causes that are furthest from the event or the ones that are hidden in the past. Likewise with effects. There are immediate effects, which are those effects that are closest to the event and easiest to see, but there are also long-term effects, those effects in the more distant future, but those which are eventually felt. Now, our lives generally are lived as a series of events, and it's useful to take a look at this on what's known as a causal chain or a timeline. On the example we're using here, everything on the left would be the causes side, the things on the right would be the effects. Let's take a look at the wreck of the Exxon Valdez. The Exxon Valdez was a giant oil supertanker that crashed off the coast of Alaska some years ago. Well, what caused this to happen? Well, the oil tanker hit a reef. What was the immediate effect of this oil tanker hitting the reef? Well, it caused an oil spill when it broke open. What was the effect of this oil spill happening? Well, there was a cleanup attempt, which basically failed. What was the effect then of the oil spill and the failed cleanup? Well, the wildlife died and the fishery died in that area. What was then the effect of the wildlife and the fishery dying off? Well, the fishing there was destroyed. This was an important thing because there was an Indian tribe that lived in that area that made their lives from fishing in those waters, catching salmon and other fish like that. And they were basically, their life and their livelihoods was destroyed by this environmental disaster. What was then the effect of this fishery being destroyed? Well, there were various lawsuits. Exxon was sued by everybody. They were sued by the Alaskan government. They were sued by the American Indian tribe. They were sued by the government. They were sued by all kinds of people. What were then the effects of the lawsuits? Well, the court rulings ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, we can start with the event and go backwards and look at the causes. What was it that caused this oil tanker to crash into a reef? Well, bad navigation, partially. It was at night, for one thing, and you might think, well, why wasn't this being taken into consideration? Well, it turns out that it was the third mate who was piloting the boat. You might be asking, well, why wasn't the captain piloting the boat? Well, it turns out the captain had been drinking. Well, why was the captain drinking? Well, it turns out that the captain in the past had been alcoholic. Now, when we are looking at this causal chain, where we started was with the wreck of the Exxon Valdez when it hit the reef. In that case, everything from that incident forward is an effect. Everything from that incident backwards would be a cause. However, whether something is a cause or is an effect has to do with your perspective and where you enter the causal chain or the timeline. For example, if you were a lawyer involved in this case, then from your perspective, everything from the lawsuits forward would be an effect, and everything from the lawsuits backward would be a cause. On the other hand, if you were the third mate for the ship, then from your perspective, when you're piloting the boat, everything from that incident forward would have been an effect, and everything from that incident backwards would have been a cause from your perspective. So it depends where you drop in on the timeline, whether things are considered a cause or an effect to some extent. Now, when you're writing a cause or effect paper, it depends on what you know. For example, if you know the causes, then the paper you're writing is to determine the effects. Let me give you an example. The governor just approved a tax hike. How will this affect the average family of four? In this case, the governor just approving a tax hike is the cause. How will this affect the average family of four is a determination of the effects. Let's look at this now. The governor just approved a tax hike. How will this affect the average family of four? The scratch outline for this paper is actually pretty simple and looks kind of like this. The introduction would be talking about the causes, which in this case would be the tax hike. The body of the paper would be a discussion of the effects of this tax hike on a family of four. And then a conclusion would be probably something along the lines of this is a good idea or this is not a good idea. Also now, if what you know on the other hand are the effect, and then the paper is an analysis of the causes. Let me give you an example of that. The school bond measure failed. Why did the voters reject it? In this case, the school bond measure failing is the effect. Why did the voters reject it is asking you to analyze the causes of why that happened. And in this case, the school bond measure failed. Why did the voters reject it? The layout for this type of paper would look like this in the scratch outline. The introduction would talk about the effect, which is the school bond measure failed. The body of the paper then would be an analysis of the causes explaining why did this happen. And then the conclusion would be something along the lines of what can we do to make sure this doesn't happen again. When you do cause and effect analysis, often, however, you will be asked to analyze causes and the effects on particular subjects, and generally in a historical perspective. This, of course, includes the idea that something has happened long enough ago that the causes are known and the effects are known, and what you are doing is doing an analysis of that. Let's use this for our example. Examine the causes and the effects of the wreck of the Exxon Valdez, including environmental, economic, and legal impacts. In this case, obviously, they're asking for both. What caused this to happen, and what have been the effects after that happened. When you're writing this type of cause and effect analysis, it's good to start with what's known as an alternate beginning. An alternate beginning is an introduction where what you do is you start with the most exciting or the most important event in the chain of events. This is because if, for example, with the Exxon Valdez story, if you started back with telling a story about a man who had a drinking problem and then went forward and up to the time of the accident and then beyond, it wouldn't be very interesting or exciting. Now, they use this technique all the time in movies. They'll start a movie with something like a murder, and then what will happen is, as the story is told, is they'll go back in time to show what led up to this, what were the causes, and then they will also go from the event of the murder forward and solve the case and show you what the effects were and what the outcome was. All right? Now, this is known as the alternate beginning. You begin with the most exciting or the most dramatic event in the timeline. And in this case, it would be probably when the Exxon Valdez hit the reef and broke open. That's probably the most exciting event in the timeline. In that case, then, the body of the paper would examine the causes and explain the effects of this incident. And then the conclusion would be something like, well, this is now where we are 20 years later. A few cautions when we're writing cause and effect. The first is to avoid what's known as the post hoc fallacy. The post hoc fallacy is when a person makes an assumption that in a chain of events that an event that happened before another event caused a later event to happen. Now, this is not always true, that just because something happened before something else that it caused it to happen. Sometimes it can only just be a coincidence. In other words, with the post hoc fallacy, what you have to show is that the events in the chain are connected. All right? They have to have a proven connection from one event to another, not that they just happened in a particular order. Another thing is, when you're doing cause and effect, do not oversimplify the causes and do not oversimplify the effects. There are always usually multiple causes and multiple effects, short-term and long-term, for any incident that happens. It is very rare that a single incident has a cause or only has an effect. There are usually many effects and many causes. And also consider the immediate and the ultimate causes and effects for whatever it is that you're taking on. So, what do I want you to take away from this lesson? First of all, with causes, remember, they are the reasons why something happened, or they're the circumstances that made something happen, or that brought it about. You're answering the question, why? With effects, we're looking at the results of what happened, or the speculation about what the outcome might be if we took a particular action. We're answering the question, what happened, or what if? Remember, our lives are lived as a chain or a series of events. We can look at this on a causal chain or on a timeline and examine it and look at the causes and look at the effects. And when you do cause and effect analysis, begin with what you know, and then analyze the causes or determine the effects. Or in some cases, you'll do both. Last, pattern your paper to fit the analysis that you're doing. Whether you are explaining causes or you're determining the effects or doing both. Okay, that'll do it. Talk to you later.